Hello again, Dan Alasso here with Chapter 11 of Ancient and Medieval World History. And today we're going to cover a slice of time from about 950 to about 1100. So let's begin. Although Charlemagne and the Carolingians who followed him did fail to create a lasting new empire, as we've seen, they did have a large and lasting impact on the culture and the economy of Western Europe. The other defining characteristic of this region at this time, which transcended languages and any interregional political differences that existed, was religion. Europeans described their place in the world as Christendom, especially when they faced challenges from outside their borders. And in this period, they started remembering the efforts of their ancestors to, for example, prevent further incursions of the Muslims, whom they called Moors or Saracens. These had become legendary and would inspire French epic poems called chansons de geste, which literally means songs of heroism, and romances of chivalry, such as the Song of Roland, which described the Battle of Roncevaux Pass in 778 as a heroic Christian struggle against the Saracens and the martyrdom of Roland. And these stories helped to establish a European Christian identity that would help to promote collective actions such as the Crusades, which we'll discuss at the end of the chapter. In the meantime, dukes, which comes from the Latin dux, meaning war leader, dukes of small territories in places like East Francia, now Germany, competed for election by their peers to the kingship. Kingships at this time were elective. And one of these, Duke Henry I of Saxony, tried to unify his neighbors against the threat of yet another invasion from the east. The Magyars, who we now call Hungarians, had originated east of the Ural Mountains long before the Common Era, but had been pushing westward since about the beginning of the Common Era. They reached the Carpathian Basin, which is the area between the Carpathian Mountains to the east and the Alps to the west, present-day Hungary, Serbia, Croatia. They reached there by the early 9th century, the early 800s. And as the Avar Khaganate faded, which I mentioned when I was discussing the Frankish expansion along the Danube in the last chapter, as this Avar Khaganate faded, they came into contact with these eastward expanding Franks. And then after the end of the Carolingian dynasty, the Magyars raided through Alsace, Burgundy, Saxony, and Provence in the first quarter of the 10th century, or the 900s. Their westward expansion was finally checked by Duke Henry's son Otto at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955. Otto, who became known as Otto the Great, who had been elected king in 936, led a force of 8,000 heavy cavalry to break the Magyar siege of Augsburg in Bavaria. The Germans defeated the Hungarians, and they hunted down all the survivors of the battle to prevent them from retreating back to their homelands and coming back again. The leaders of the invasion were then executed, and Magyar incursions westward ended. The formerly nomadic people actually settled down in the Carpathian Basin, adopted Christianity, and established the Kingdom of Hungary around 1000. Its first king, Stephen, married Gisela of Bavaria, Otto's grandniece. In 951, Otto had married Adelaide of Italy, the widow of the Lombard king who had just died. And then Otto had claimed the crown from other rivals for the succession. When these rivals continued to threaten the peace, the Pope, this would be Pope John XII, appealed to Otto for protection. And in return, he revived the imperial title and crowned Otto Emperor of Rome. For many historians, this marks the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, which continued until 1806. The merger of secular and ecclesiastical power, though, and also the Byzantine resistance to this development, could also be thought of as a continuation of the pattern that had begun with a previous pope's crowning of Charlemagne. And a period that we know as the Ottonian Renaissance ensued, which was marked particularly by the building of elaborate cathedrals as Otto forcibly spread Christianity throughout his domains. Otto expanded the abbey at Magdeburg into a cathedral in 955, and then he and the Ottonian emperors who followed him built cathedrals at Mainz, Hildesheim, Bamberg, Merseburg, Paderborn, Worms, Strasbourg, Verdun, Basel, Metz, Eichstätt, Regensburg, Augsburg, Lausanne, Dijon, and Liège, uniting a region that spans today's Germany, France, and Switzerland under their imperial authority. Although the Byzantine Church's patriarchs objected to this new Holy Roman Empire's connection of ecclesiastical with secular power, they were as interested in spreading their religion as were the popes in Rome. In the 860s, a Greek monk, Constantine, later known as Cyril, and then known as Saint Cyril, and his brother, Methodius, later known as Saint Methodius, developed an alphabet for the Slavic language, which ultimately became known as the Cyrillic alphabet. Their missionary work helped to expand the Byzantine Church into Bulgaria, Serbia, and later Russia. Vladimir, the grandson of Princess Olga of Kiev, who you'll recall from the last chapter did convert to Christianity in Constantinople, but was really unable to push it onto her subjects. This grandson, Vladimir, fled to Scandinavia when his father died. He was 14 years old at the time, in 972. But he returned with a large force of Varangians to seize Novgorod and later Kiev in 980. And after consolidating his rule, Vladimir is said to have sent emissaries out to learn about a variety of faiths that he was considering for the state religion. And according to the Primary Chronicle, which is a 12th century Rus text describing their history, he considered Judaism from the Khazars, Islam from the Volga Bulgars, Western or Latin Christianity from the Germans, and Eastern or Greek Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantines. Vladimir rejected Islam for its prohibition on alcohol and pork. He rejected Judaism due to the Khazars' loss of their homeland, and he rejected the Latin rites because he found them much too austere. His final decision in 988, however, probably rested mostly on an offer by the Byzantine Emperor Basil II of his sister, Anna Porphyrogenita, in marriage, but only if Vladimir converted. Basil also needed military aid from Vladimir, which he got. Vladimir got baptized, he married Anna, and he decreed mass baptisms in the Dnieper River. Orthodox Christianity became the state religion, and Vladimir the Great went on to become Saint Vladimir. In Asia, at about the same time, the Song Dynasty, which began in 960 and lasted till 1279, began to emerge from the chaos that had followed the collapse of the Tang Dynasty in 907, the period of fragmentation, which was known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, when China had dissolved politically into a number of short-lived regimes in the north and independent kingdoms in the south. The dynasty was founded by Zhao Kaungyin, a military general who had been born in 927, who rose through the ranks during the later Zhao dynasty. That was the final of those 5 dynasties, and then led a bloodless coup called the Chengjiao Mutiny while on a campaign against northern invaders. His soldiers proclaimed him emperor by draping him in a yellow imperial robe, and he returned to the capital, where the young Zhao emperor abdicated peacefully. Taking the throne as Emperor Taizu, he established Kaifeng as the capital, and he focused on reunifying China. To prevent future coups, Taizu centralized power, demoted generals, and emphasized the civilian bureaucracy via the imperial examination system. The dynasty that he founded is divided into the Northern Song from 960 to 1127 and the Southern Song from 1127 to 1279, when the court was relocated to Hangzhou. Despite military vulnerabilities, the Kang era lasted over 300 years until the conquest by the Mongols under Kublai Khan in 1279. Neo-Confucianism, developed by thinkers like Cheng Yi and Zhu Zi, blended Confucianism with Buddhist and Taoist ideas, influencing philosophy and education. The arts thrived with masterpieces in painting, such as landscape scrolls, poetry, ceramics, and literature. Pre-Qin bronzes and jades were collected and imitated, which reflected an ongoing reverence for the past. But the era is also marked by groundbreaking new inventions, including movable type printing by Bi Sheng around the year 1040, and gunpowder weapons, and the magnetic compass for navigation, and a permanent standing navy, the first in the world that we know of. In India, fragmentation in the north produced a variety of regional kingdoms that were frequently at war with each other. In contrast, the Chola Empire expanded from its origin in Tamil Nadu in southeastern India to Sri Lanka, the Malabar coast, and the Maldive Islands. Textiles were the basis of the Chola economy, and cotton cloth was the empire's main export, although the Tamil weavers also became famous for their skills with silk. Other important exports were sugar and Wootz steel. Sugar, which is sakara in Sanskrit, had originally been native to New Guinea, where it was first cultivated about 10,000 years ago. Its use spread to India long enough ago that Alexander the Great encountered it there in the 4th century BCE. Fairly large-scale production spread to southern India, and by the Chola era, Tamil Nadu was a center of production, and sugar was an important export. Wootz steel is an ultra-high carbon crucible steel that is legendary for its strength, its sharpness, and the distinctive wavy patterns that we associate with Damascus blades. The technique, which is now lost, originated in southern India in the 6th century BCE and continued until the 18th century, with significant production during the Chola Empire. Known locally as Ukku or Urku in Tamil, it was forged using a crucible process involving mixing iron ore, charcoal, and glass flux that was heated in a sealed clay crucible to produce ingots with 1.5 to 2% carbon content, enabling superplasticity and high impact hardness. Archaeological evidence from 10th century Chola sites, including furnaces and slag, confirms the production, with exports to the Middle East, where it was reforged into those Damascus swords. In the Islamic world, the centralized power of the Abbasid Caliphate was beginning to give way to more regionally based dynasties, at the very same time that scientific and philosophical production was peaking. In Persia, the Shiite Buyid dynasty seized control of Baghdad in 945, while the Fatimid Caliphate, established in North Africa in 909, took control of Cairo in 969. Mahmud of Ghazni established the Sunni Ghaznavid Empire in Afghanistan and in northern India in 998. And then between 1001 and 1027, he conducted 17 raids into India, sacking Hindu temples for their wealth. And this facilitated the spread of Islam into that region, while it also caused widespread destruction. The Sunni Seljuk Turks then took Baghdad away in 1055 and ended Buyid rule and restored Sunni orthodoxy. The Seljuks defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, which opened Anatolia to Turkic settlement and weakened Byzantine defenses. In Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, the last vestige of the Umayyad Caliphate, fragmented into a number of small kingdoms after civil wars, which led to a period of cultural patronage but political weakness, and making the region vulnerable to Christian reconquest efforts during the Spanish Reconquista. The Sunni Berber Almoravids unified North Africa and invaded Al-Andalus in 1086, halting Christian advances at the Battle of Zalaca. and then imposing stricter Islamic practices. Muslim trade networks expanded across the Sahara, connecting North Africa with sub-Saharan Africa, and facilitating the spread of Islam into West African kingdoms such as Ghana. The kingdom or empire known as Ouagadougou, or the land of herds in the local Soninke language, was a prosperous empire that had become known to Islam in accounts by Arab geographers like al-Fazari and Ibn Hawqal in the 9th and 10th centuries. Ghana's wealth was based on trade in gold, salt, ivory, and slaves. Although its power was beginning to wane by the 11th century, it hung on until it was absorbed around 1240 by the even more powerful Mali Empire, which we'll cover in the next chapter. While all these political changes were taking place, Muslim philosophy and science were reaching new heights. Ibn al-Haytham, who was known as al-Hazan, who died in 1039, pioneered optics in his Book of Optics. Al-Biruni, who died in 1050, advanced astronomy, mathematics, and geography, and accurately calculated the Earth's radius. Ibn Sina, who the West knew as Avicenna, and who died in 1037, completed the Canon of Medicine, a foundational medical text that was used in Europe for centuries. Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, wrote The Revival of the Religious Sciences to try to reconcile Sufism and critiquing philosophy. Ferdowsi completed the Persian epic Shahnameh, preserving pre-Islamic Iranian legends. And in Cairo, the Al-Azhar Mosque became one of the world's first universities and a center of Islamic learning. And while this Islamic scholarship was exploring new areas of philosophy and science, the Christian world was falling into a schism that was as much political as it was theological. The Eastern Orthodox Church, based in Constantinople, and the Roman Catholic Church, based in Rome, differed on some very esoteric interpretations of the Nicene Creed that dealt with the relationship between the Father and the Son and the Spirit, aspects of the divinity. They also disagreed on the recipe for the Eucharist, should it be leavened or unleavened bread, on fasting practices, and on clerical celibacy. The larger differences, however, I think were political disagreements, both within the church organizations and in their relationships with outside authority. Internally, the Catholics regarded their Pope as the direct descendant of St. Peter, and thus the highest authority on earth, while the Eastern Church preferred an ecumenical relationship, in which the 5 patriarchs of Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria would each have equal votes. The Byzantines also saw the crowning of Charlemagne, and later of the Holy Roman Emperors, as a direct challenge to their authority as the real Roman Empire. And of course, the Catholics spoke Latin and the Orthodox spoke Greek. And this all came to a head in 1053, when the Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople closed Latin churches in the city and criticized Western practices. Pope Leo IX responded by sending a delegation led by Cardinal Humbert to assert his papal supremacy and try to resolve the disputes. Negotiations failed, and after Leo IX's death in 1054, Humbert dramatically placed a bull of excommunication against Cerularius on the altar of Hagia Sophia, the world's biggest cathedral, in 1054. Cerularius retaliated by convening a synod that excommunicated the delegates. And these mutual excommunications symbolized the schism and solidified the separation of Christianity into 2 major traditions: Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodoxy in the East. And then after the schism, each developed distinct hierarchies, liturgies, and doctrines as they drifted further apart. And the divide deepened with the Crusades, particularly with the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when a Catholic army would sack Constantinople. And we'll talk about that a bit in the next chapter. But before we get to the Crusades, let's look at another European invasion that dramatically changed the world for English-speaking people: The culture of the British Isles, after the Romans had departed in 410, was dominated by Germanic tribes, such as the Angles, from Germany roughly, the Saxons, who were roughly Danish, and the Jutes, who were Dutch, with additional influence from the Vikings and some continuation of earlier Celtic traditions. Christianity had arrived in 597 with Augustine, who became St. Augustine. And by the end of the millennium, about 1.5 million people lived in an agrarian feudal economy in England and Wales, with possibly another 750,000 more in Scotland and Ireland. William was the Duke of Normandy, that's the land of the Northmen, a region of northern France that had been settled by Vikings beginning in the 9th century. The region had been formally transferred to their control after their leader, Rollo, was granted the land by the French king Charles the Simple in exchange for a promise of no further raids and their conversion to Christianity. William claimed to be a 6th-generation descendant of Rollo. His French-speaking army of about 8,000 men included descendants of Vikings, as well as allies from Brittany and Flanders and the rest of France. The crisis was precipitated by the death of the English king Edward the Confessor, who reigned from 1042 to 1066. Before taking the throne, Edward had spent many years in exile in Normandy, and when he died childless in 1066, his brother-in-law, Harold, had been crowned king. But William claimed that Edward had promised the crown to him, and he assembled a fleet of 700 ships to transport his 8,000 troops. They crossed the Channel in September and fought a day-long battle at Hastings on October 14th, 1066. The new English king Harold was killed in the battle, and William moved on to London, where he was greeted with submission by the English nobles. He was crowned King William I of England on Christmas Day. The conquest led to widespread social and cultural changes. William redistributed most of the good land to Norman lords and replaced much of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. French became the language of court, with William and the kings who followed him not even bothering to learn English until about the 1300s. William's Norman Dynasty lasted less than a century and ended with his grandson, although the Plantagenets that succeeded to the throne were related through William's granddaughter Matilda. The first of these was Henry II, who inherited a domain that included a good part of what is now France. His sons, Richard I, the Lionheart, and John, would both be kings in their turns, and we'll discuss Richard and John in the next chapter. Culturally, Norman French influenced the English language, creating Middle English with thousands of loan words such as beef and court. The Domesday Book, which was written in 1086, was a comprehensive survey of England's lands and resources. It was written to aid taxation and administration, and it's become an invaluable source of insight into medieval life and the medieval economy. Architecture shifted with the introduction of Romanesque or Norman styles, which are seen in castles like the Tower of London. Before the Normans, the English built almost entirely out of wood rather than stone. The stone castles of Britain were all Norman or later. William built the White Tower at the Tower of London in 1078, and he and his heirs lived in it. The Plantagenets used it as a fortified residence, but had their main residence at Westminster or at Windsor Castle. English resentment of Norman rule led to a tradition, which was codified under King John in the Magna Carta, of the ancient liberties and free customs of the city of London, and the ritual of the monarch asking permission to enter the city. William built the tower just outside the eastern boundary of the old Roman wall that defines the 1 square mile city. Over time, the Norman fortress has become considered a part of the wall itself, but it is still officially crown property just outside the city limits. And now the Crusades. Alarmed by the expansion of the Seljuk Turks into his territory, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent ambassadors into Italy to request support. In late 1095, Pope Urban II made an appeal to the Christian knights of Europe to rally to the aid of Constantinople by liberating Jerusalem from Muslim control. The Pope promised not only land and wealth, but the remission of sins for men who would take on the quest. The connection with Jerusalem was that it was a destination for pilgrims, which was supposedly threatened by Muslim control of the city. Although Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands for over 450 years by that point. The crusade unfolded in two main phases. First, the People's Crusade began in 1096, led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit, with poorly organized peasants and minor nobles who marched ahead, committing atrocities that included attacks on Jewish communities in the Rhineland before they even left Europe. This army suffered heavy losses in Anatolia against the Turks and was really wiped out before they could get to the Holy Land. A second Prince's Crusade followed, with armies led by nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond IV of Toulouse, and the oldest son of William the Conqueror, Robert Curthose. They captured Nicaea in 1097, besieged Antioch from 1097 to 1098, amid starvation and internal disputes, and finally took Jerusalem in July 1099, after a brutal siege, after which they massacred over 10,000 of the city's 30,000 Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Most of the rest were sold into slavery. The loot that they took out of Jerusalem really didn't defray the costs of the crusade. But in addition to what the Christian knights were able to carry away after the First Crusade, they discovered an exotic spice that they described as sweet salt. Prior to the Crusades, sugar had been well established in the Muslim world, where Arabs had mastered its cultivation and processing by the 7th century, spreading it across the Middle East and into the Mediterranean through conquests and trade. Europeans, who primarily relied on honey as a sweetener, encountered sugar for the first time during these campaigns in the Holy Land. Specifically in 1099, when crusaders like Godfrey of Bouillon captured Jerusalem from the Fatimid Caliphate and established the Crusader states, they discovered sugar production as a profitable local industry in the city and the surrounding regions. Chroniclers like William of Tyre, writing later in the 12th century, described sugar as very necessary for the use and health of mankind, and highlighted its perceived medicinal value alongside its sweetness. Returning crusaders brought samples back to Europe, sparking demand among the elite. The first recorded mention of sugar in England, for example, corresponds to this First Crusade. The introduction of sugar production into Europe by Arabs in Sicily led to Venice becoming a key sugar refining and distributing center by the 12th century. But sugar remained a luxury item for centuries due to its rarity and its high cost. And I'm spending so much time here on sugar because it becomes central to early modern history when the Portuguese and the Spanish, and then later the French and the English, figure out that it can be very profitably grown on islands off the coast of Africa and then islands in the Caribbean. But that's much later in the story, and we've reached the end for today. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.